So this is a exercise that one of the students in the foundation drawing class asked for. These are the sources I used. This was done at the suggestion of Abdullah Khan. And basically I'm going to try and sketch these sources you just saw using some of the techniques we've gone over in class. So you'll note here I am beginning by just generally outlining the major volumes, much as we've done with the still lifes in class, just establishing the basic flat shapes, the area that's covered, the real estate, if you will, on the page. So I'm just lightly sketching the limbs in a very flat fashion. You'll notice there's just an oval for the head. There's no dimensionality to it. What I will eventually do, as I'm starting to do in these areas in the lower body, is establish the ellipses that give this thing some volume and breadth. Basically, the approach for something like this, which is a very complicated illustration, it has a lot of levels of not transparency per se, but actual visibility and absence. So you have a skeleton and a ostensible some kind of musculature that has worn away, the sinew's gone away, and you have the wrappings of mummification around this form. So you have this discrete space between the skeleton underneath, the endoskeleton, and the surface skin, which is made up of these strips of linen. So the way you would approach this is to start by establishing the geometry in really flat shapes, then give that geometry some form, right? We want to turn the arms into cylinders, as you can see at the upper right, and then refine that form to get it more precise, to get it to reflect the actual shapes. And now we have to eventually, within those cylinders, build yet even smaller cylinders inside them to be the skeletons, so that we have the outer surface and we have the interior surfaces. So we have two forms that we are dealing with here. We have a form that is peeling away, which are these mummification wraps, and then we have this solid form that is not fabric, that is a skeleton. So this incorporates a lot of the more difficult exercises we've done together as a class, insofar as it covers fabric, fluid forms bending over other forms, and it's culminating in basically a anatomy exercise, because this is a figure. So the challenges this presents are very interesting. I suggest all of you guys try something like this, over the winter break, and really set something up like this for yourself to draw, because it will allow you to synthesize all of the things we've been putting together. Again, always remember that order of operations. We start with line. Line is the most important thing. We consider composition so that we know where we're placing the head. I tried to place the head more or less in the same place as in the source. I'm using paper. I'm drawing 1-to-1 scale in this. And that's important for something this complicated. I would draw either at scale or go larger, because again, these things are difficult to articulate. We're building these curves over the skeleton, and the skeleton doesn't really inform those folds. What we have to do is kind of build an outer field that's kind of the shape of a body. Not really, right? Because his abdomen's missing, and that's the area where those sort of ribbons just kind of are falling apart in on themselves, which go to creating that effect of this thing being just a pile of ribbons draped around a skeleton. So those questions I always ask you guys to ask yourself about something. What is it? What is it doing? How is it doing it? It's giving us an impression of depth inside a figure that is once there, outwardly has a surface, and yet is revealing its interior to us. How is it doing that? With a lot of elaborate line work that gives us forms that give us a sense that they're wrapping around this endoskeleton on the inside. That is the first step towards understanding your approach. Once I went through that in my mind, I knew that I really had to build that outer surface first, and then within it, build the skeleton. Almost like referring, in some senses, at least functionally, if not observationally, to the transparency and translucency exercises we did. Remember that. We did that just recently when there's bottles in front of other bottles, the shapes that are enclasped in other shapes when a bottle is in front of another bottle. You can use those. Those are part of your toolkit now to build an illustration like this. This is why drawing from observation is important. Even though I'm dealing with an absolutely fictive, i.e. imaginary form or shape, the things I picked up when I did the translucency and transparency exercises many years ago and have done many years since, it allows me to understand forms like this and build approaches for them. So you'll notice my pencil lines, I'm trying to be as specific as possible. I apparently get lost in a couple of spots, if you see in the middle section. The one-to-one representation of this illustration, I would say, is not as important as creating the effect. I'm not reproducing this for a one-to-one direct illustration. If I had to do that, I might use the aid of a light table and do some light tracing and then go back and do it, just because this is necessarily uncomplicated. What's more important is the effect. What's more important is that you believe that this linen is wrapping around this figure, that you believe that space and depth. Note as well, there is a sort of abyss in the center of the face. That is an effect that can be created with the tonality exercises you guys have done. The stippling around the edges to give it a sense as though the face is caved in. Also note that I didn't work from the color original, right? I created a black and white, took away all the negative space I didn't need, and just left the black areas kind of around the form. That helps me to further understand the abstraction going on in this shape. Color, as I have noted many times, is its own concern. It's a whole other challenge and part of an image that I think in many ways deserves its own course of study. Color belongs with tonality and texture as part of the details of something. There are situations where you would consider color first, of course, but for the purposes of this, for the purposes of creating images and understanding them rationally, so that you guys proceed from a point of view that is ordered and analytical and not just messy expressionism, you begin with line, you use line to build your shapes, you turn your shapes into forms, meaning that those 2D shapes become three-dimensional forms, rectangles become cylinders, etc., etc., triangles become cones, etc., etc., rectangles become prisms and rhomboids, etc., etc. And then from there, you can start dialing it in. One of the things I want you guys to take away from this fall semester with me is the extent to which all drawing, in a certain sense, is a process of refinement. All drawing begins very simply and then progresses. So you'll note I went from pencil and got as much of it down as possible, because that allows me to be guided in doing this. Now, are there situations where I would just go straight to inking? Sure. I wouldn't do that in this situation because I'm working from a subject that I'm largely trying to reproduce. I'm trying to be guided by this, so I want to proceed as rationally as possible, and that begins with, under pencil drawing. This is a technique in illustration that is possibly most familiar to you all from the world of comic books and sequential art and comic strips. In comic books, there is traditionally a penciler who sometimes does not finish the work. Sometimes it goes from the penciling and plotting, meaning that they determine the composition of the images, the posture of the figures, and do a great amount of the drawing, but the actual quote-unquote finishing or inking is done by another artist. Today, as likely as not, one person would do both. In my practice, I've only worked with inkers once or twice. I generally tend to ink my own work. I tend to think it goes faster that way. I also get to exercise more control over the final look of a drawing. I'm sometimes not happy, frankly, with what inkers do with my work. I've rarely had to ink other people's work. For the same reasons, conversely, I don't like to do that either. But it's important that you guys understand that division of labor, because that division of labor is really a division of process. It evolved in comics for speed so that a penciler could get through the first 22 to 24 pages of a monthly magazine or of a monthly comic book. And by the time, he was on page 5, someone could take those first 5 pages from him and start inking them. And that way they would always make their deadlines. But for you, the most important part of that process isn't so much that handoff, unless you are working with someone. What is most important about that process is that staging. Note how in the last 3 classes, I've been really hard on you guys about building your line, building your structure, building your composition, building the initial shapes with line first, even before necessarily moving on to form. Then moving on to form, and only then, and only then, moving on to details, tonality that describes shadow and light sources, and texture that gives us surfaces, such as glass or rough porous surfaces that we can use with any of the number of techniques that we've covered in the class. The hatching, cross-hatching, the blending, and the stippling, that sort of composition of density by using a progressive series of dots in a given area. So here you'll see I'm using very, very discrete lines, however short, however long. I'm not hatching. I'm not feeling my way around the line. That's the other big advantage of working in pencil first. You can search for the line and sort of draw fuzzy lines when you're penciling, although again, I have been stressing that I'd like you guys to get away from that and draw more confidently. The effect of fuzzy lines can be one of two things. It can either impart energy to a drawing, a kind of expressionism, or in the worst case scenario, it makes it look like there's a lot of unmotivated drawing in there, meaning that there's a lot of undecisive searching work. Most viewers who are not artists can't tell you that that's what it is, but that's the impression it gives them, however unconsciously. So you want to avoid that. You want to practice your primitives. Practice those shapes we take for granted, those basic polygonals. I'm sure if you think back to that first class, everyone was looking at the shapes I was putting up, those hexagons and polyhedrons, and going, oh my God, this stuff is basic stuff I know from math, even from kindergarten. And yet, as I displayed to you or explained to you over and over again, very few people have at the core level of their draftsmanship a real mastery of those shapes. Most people, most draftsmen, most artists, a lot of illustrators, a shocking amount of illustrators, can't draw a simple triangle, can't draw a regular cube or square without a lot of mess, without a lot of erasing. You guys have to progress to that point. It doesn't take long to do that. Frankly, you can do it over the course of 30 days. If you devote 15 minutes to it at the front of whatever sketchbook or notebook you have, just 15 minutes a day, just drawing squares, circles. Circles in particular and ellipses are super important because you want to be able to draw those from any angle on the fly. That's what will allow you to draw ever more organically. I know that seems counterintuitive, that something so straight and regular, like a circle, which is even all the way around, or a square, which has all equal sides, that would help you draw. But it does, because it gives you mastery over your, hand-eye coordination. It gives you confidence. You won't be searching to lay down these lines. And in the end, drawing is, among other things, a kind of penmanship. If you draw confident lines, it's really a matter of knowing where to place them. As you guys have seen through the entire semester, so much of this has come down to seeing properly and then laying down the lines where they belong. Every single drawing every one of you has done in this class has had all the constituent elements to make an accurate drawing. Many times the lines are simply in the wrong place, or they're in the wrong scale, or in the wrong proportion, or the curve doesn't match what you're actually seeing. So the more you can dynamically draw these forms, these ellipses, parallelograms, these diamond shapes, you can apply them in situations in varying scales, and that will help you accomplish things like perspective, foreshortening, where a hand is coming towards you. The classic example that I shared with you that has given myself and so many of my colleagues so many problems over the years. It's complicated stuff, but just because it's complicated doesn't mean it's impossible. If you break things down into their correct order, again, line, confident, bold lines that describe shapes accurately. Once you get those shapes, those two-dimensional shapes down, you can turn them into three-dimensional shapes. Think discretely in this anatomical example of this, mummy wraith. Look at that arm that's telescoping away from us. How did I accomplish that bend in that arm so that it looks like it's bending back away from us as opposed to its own left hand, which is advancing towards us? It's simply a rectangle that's built at an angle, and then the cylinder that I built that rectangle out of, that's tilting away, gives us that depth, gives us that sense of a solid object that is cylindrical and long, beginning at the shoulder, bending at the elbow, and bending away from us. I should make a note. You see where I've circled the upper right, where that thumb is, or where the end of that thumb is with the nail. And I actually was aware of it and still repeated it. That is what we would call a tangent. That is the one thing in this illustration, or perhaps this is a still. I think it's an illustration, though. That thumb is aligned with the index finger, so it tends to disappear, right? So what would we want to do? We would like to bend that thumb, maybe crook it inward so that it's perpendicular to the other fingers, anything that gives it more depth, right? Already this figure is a little flatter than it should be. What helps it a lot is this vortex of these, ribbons. And if you look at the right leg at the back, the way it's bending backwards, that is all accomplished, by these forms, these ribbons. So that's pretty much it. That's this exercise. I hope it makes sense. I'm glad Abdullah, asked me to do this because, again, it does, even as a piece of illustration, it does synthesize so many of the things we've gone over in this class and sort of unifies them in one illustration. So there you have it. I did it in, I think, just under 19 minutes. which is very, relatively fast for something like this. It doesn't have all the richness of the original. If you look at the original on the right, there's much more shading and things like that. Those are details. I went for the structure. Abdullah specifically wanted to know how this was built in terms of line, in terms of what he talked to me about, and that's what I tried to accomplish for this. So maybe you guys can discuss amongst yourselves where else, there should be more detail, more texture, etc., to help these forms be more convincing. We've got the structure. Where does the detail come in? All right, thanks for listening. Take care, guys.